Hey guys, what is up? Welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, and just welcome in general. My name is Jessica, and here on my channel, I explore new true crime cases each week. So if you're interested in true crime and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. Other than that, let's go ahead and get started. So our story today begins in Derby, Connecticut, which, fun fact, is actually the smallest city in Connecticut, so you're welcome. I'm sure that knowledge will be useful literally never. But along with being an itty-bitty little city, it was also where Teresa Ann Grace Tottenham was born in November 1968. Now, Teresa grew up in a pretty big family. She had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, obviously making her one of 6 kids, which is a lot of kids. I've got 3 and I'm running on fumes almost daily, so I tip my hat to Teresa's parents. Especially because it seems like most, if not all of their kids, grew up to be pretty successful. Teresa, in particular, was always incredibly intelligent. She graduated as valedictorian of her high school in 1986 before going on to Fairfield University, where she graduated with a Master's of Science in Biology. Once she had her master's, she made her way to the Ross University School of Medicine in Barbados, where she graduated with honors in 1996. And once she'd finished school, Teresa moved to Florida to complete her medical residency. She did that at the University of Florida, where she was awarded Resident of the Year. Obviously, Teresa was super driven, super hardworking, super dedicated. I mean, she very clearly excelled in literally everything she did. Meanwhile, you've got people like me who squeak by on wafer thin ice just to barely get their high school diploma. Anyways, fast forward to good old Y2K. Teresa's in her 30s, she's living in St. Pete, Florida, working at an outpatient clinic, and she's actually newly married to a man named Kenny Cousins. The two had met online while Teresa was doing clinical research in Charleston, South Carolina, and although they'd initially really hit it off, bonding over their love of music, food, and the outdoors, sadly their marriage would be a short one, coming to an end after just 3 years in early 2003. But despite the fact that their romantic relationship had fizzled out pretty quickly, Teresa and Kenny's friendship was much more resilient. Even when Teresa remarried just 7 months after their divorce, she and Kenny still remained friends and would actually keep in touch periodically through the remainder of her life. So who was Teresa's new boo, you may be wondering? Well, very shortly after her divorce, a friend of hers named Stacy Severs introduced her to her brother Mark Severs. And Teresa and Mark took a pretty immediate liking to one another, and after dating for just a couple of months, they found out they were expecting a baby, therefore they decided their best option was to get married. They officially tied the knot in late 2003 on a beach surrounded by their friends and family, and just 6 months later, Teresa would give birth to their first daughter. Even though their relationship came together pretty quickly, it was clear to the people who knew them that they were going to build a pretty incredible life together. In 2005, they moved to Bonita Springs, Florida, and built their dream house. In 2006, Teresa opened up her own holistic medical practice, and in 2007, she and Mark welcomed a second daughter into their family. Overall, the Severs really did seem to have, and feel free to say it with me here, a seemingly perfect life. Teresa was an incredibly brilliant and gifted doctor. Mark was a doting husband working side by side with his wife as the office manager at Restorative Health and Healing Center. They had the beautiful home. They had their beautiful children. I mean, I'd imagine that everyone believed things were going very, very well for this family, which brings us to June 2015. It was the beginning of summer, and the Severs had a family trip planned up north. They were either going to Connecticut or New York. I think it was Connecticut because that's where Teresa's family was from, but I've seen it reported both ways, so in the interest of not completely misspeaking, let's just say that they were way northeast. They spent a nice weekend up there together, and although Mark and the girls still had a few days left for their portion of the trip, Teresa had to cut her portion short so that she could make sure that she would be home and back to work Monday for her patients. So she flew home alone on Sunday, June 28th, arriving at Southwest Florida International Airport late that evening. She was captured via CCTV footage wheeling her bag through the airport towards the parking lot, and her parking receipt shows that she left the airport headed home at around 10:55 p.m. Teresa was due into work at 9 a.m. the following morning, but she would never show up. At around 9:15, her staff started to get pretty confused and rightfully concerned. I mean, she'd flown over 1,000 miles the day before specifically to be at work, so it was really weird that she wasn't there. And she also wasn't answering any phone calls or text messages. The whole situation was just very weird and very out of character. Out of desperation, Teresa's assistant Sandra reached out to Mark to see if maybe he knew what was going on. Because remember, not only was Mark Teresa's husband, but he was also the clinic manager. So if anyone had insight as to what was going on with her, you'd think it would be him. But unfortunately, he seemed just as confused as everyone else. And he's like 1,200 miles away. So he decided to reach out to a longtime close friend of Teresa's, Dr. Mark Petritis. Dr. Petritis was actually on his way to work at his own surgical practice when he received the call. But once Mark explained what was going on and that he was really worried about Teresa, Dr. Petritis agreed to turn around and make his way towards the Sievers home to check on his friend. He pulled up to their house around 9:30 a.m. and at first he tried just knocking on the front door, but no one answered. So from there, using the code that Mark had given him, he went ahead and opened the Sievers garage. And as soon as the garage door opened, Dr. Petritis noticed that the door leading from the garage to inside the house was wide open. Even so, he felt extremely uncomfortable just barging into his friend's house unannounced, because for all he knew, she was just in the shower or something. So from where he was standing in the garage, he tried calling out Teresa's name, but again, he received no answer. So he cautiously made his way from the garage into the home, where sadly he would ultimately discover 46-year-old Teresa Sievers dead on her kitchen floor. It was fairly obvious right away to Dr. Petritis that Teresa was gone. She was unresponsive, she was cold, and she had a massive head wound, which was assumably caused by a hammer that was lying near her body. Nevertheless, Dr. Petritis did still check for a pulse to see if he could possibly help her in any way before he determined that he really just couldn't, and he exited the home and called 911.
911, what is your emergency?
I'm at a friend's house. He's out of town, and I came here to check on his wife, and she's dead on the floor. My friend, Teresa Sievers, she's a doctor. I'm a doctor. She came home last night, and she was supposed to go to work at 9 o'clock. She called me, and I was on my way into work, so I swung by, and she's dead on the floor. And there's a hammer at the side, and she's bashed in the back of the head.
Following his call to 911, Dr. Petritis called Mark back and told him that he needed to come home as soon as humanly possible. He was purposefully vague during this conversation with Mark because he really didn't feel like it was appropriate or like it was even his place to tell this man that his wife had been murdered over the phone. He did explain to Mark that Teresa had been hurt, but he did not go into explicit detail regarding what he'd found. And in response to this, Mark, who, mind you, is frequently described as having worshipped the ground his wife walked on, only asked if their home had been robbed. He didn't ask what happened to Teresa. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask if she was being taken to a hospital. He didn't ask if she was alive. He didn't ask about their dogs. Nothing. I mean, even Sheila Davalloo asked about her dogs. But for argument's sake, as I mention in about 95% of my videos, everyone handles situations like this differently. There is no cookie cutter appropriate response to trauma or to crisis. Conversely, it's actually been proven time and time again that someone's affect following a tragedy says very little about, anything. That said, I do think that certain questions like what happened and is she going to be okay are things that I'd assume most people would probably ask robotically, without even having to give it a conscious thought. But Mark didn't do any of that. He just asked multiple times if their house had been robbed, which it hadn't, but I'll get there in a minute. Actually, we're basically there now, so welcome. Obviously, following the 911 call, police responded to the Sievers residence to start their investigation. And while they were immediately able to identify signs of forced entry into the home in the form of pry marks along the edge of the door, they were also able to rule out robbery as a motive almost just as quickly, because not only had the house not been ransacked, but the Sievers' extensive and expensive gun collection was still present and accounted for. There were tons of prescription pill bottles lying around that hadn't been touched, and most notably, there was $40,000 worth of cash in the home that was easily found, but had also been left completely undisturbed. Honestly, there really wasn't anything significant in the Sievers house that could even begin to indicate to police what a possible motive for this attack could have been. It clearly wasn't a robbery gone wrong, so what could it have been? Who on earth had a reason to want to harm Teresa Sievers? Well, surprisingly, the answer is more people than you might initially be inclined to think. You see, there is a lot of glowing statements online about Teresa and what a wonderful person she was. And while I don't doubt that those are true, you cannot look into this case without also coming across plenty of statements from people who knew Teresa explaining that she wasn't for everyone. Which, I mean, who is? I don't think that there is a single person in the world who is universally adored by everyone. And Teresa in particular is often referred to as a spitfire, someone who was assertive, that knew what she wanted and how she wanted it and exactly how she intended to get it. Someone that had a bit of a potty mouth, and someone that wasn't afraid to call people out, warranted or not. So as they dug into Teresa's personal and professional relationships and kind of started to gather information, it definitely got easier to pinpoint people who might be worth looking into. Not surprisingly, they started by looking into Mark. Duh, the spouse is always the first suspect, obviously. But he was over 1,000 miles away at the time Teresa was killed, so he really didn't stay a person of interest for too long. Especially not once they started looking into Sandra Hoskins and her husband, Frank Pays. Yes, that's Sandra, Teresa's assistant. You see, Sandra's husband, Frank, also worked at a restorative health and healing center, and neither he nor his wife were especially keen on the way that they were treated by Teresa. Sandra was actually planning on handing in her resignation that day, as in the day that Teresa's body was found. And supposedly, Sandra was very open about the fact that she was not Teresa's biggest fan. Sometimes just straight up talking shit about her to patients, which, given the circumstances, she was probably starting to really regret. Because to police that are investigating a murder with very little to go on, a hostile work environment can start to smell a lot like a motive. So Sandra kind of jumped to the top of the list of persons of interest. However, police were eventually able to rule her out, leaving them right back at square one. From there, they briefly entertained the idea that some sort of shadowy government group might be responsible for Teresa's death, because right before she died, 2 other prominent holistic alternative medicine doctors had also died. So the theory was that maybe these doctors were being targeted because their alternative approach to medicine posed a threat to Big Pharma. But this too turned out to be a dead end, as it was ultimately determined that the 3 deaths were completely unrelated. And unfortunately, for a couple of weeks, that was kinda it. Teresa was laid to rest 8 days after her death, with absolutely no leads as to who might be responsible. At her service, Mark is reported to have seemed pretty on edge, just nervous, fidgety, looking around a lot. He even showed up with one of his guns strapped to his waist, which I guess some people found odd. And I do get why people might think that's weird, but I'm kind of indifferent to it, if I'm being honest. I know people that carry their firearm with them literally everywhere, so I don't know, the information just didn't make me clutch my pearls the way it seems to have done to so many other people. Maybe it should have, but I don't think it's that weird to have a heightened interest in protecting yourself once you've been so closely connected to something like this. Even if you're not personally connected, if something this violent happened where you lived and whoever was responsible was still out there and police didn't seem remotely close to catching them, I'm not even a gun person and I might be strapped up at that point. You never know. Why am I still talking about this? The takeaway from all of that nonsensical rambling is twofold. 1, people thought Mark was acting like a big ol' weirdo. And 2, the investigation into who killed Teresa was not going well. That is until 2 weeks after the murder, when police received a very random tip pointing the finger at a man named Curtis Wayne Wright. Now, I'm going to stop you right there because no, I did not make a mistake and accidentally put Mark's picture here instead of Curtis's. No, as you can see from this photo here of Curtis and this photo here of Mark, these motherfuckers are twins. I mean, not genetically, but I'll be damned if they don't look scary similar. So if not Mark Seaver's twin, who is Curtis Wayne Wright? Well, for starters, he goes by Wayne. And in 2015, he was a 5-time convicted felon living in Missouri and working as an IT specialist. Oh, and did I mention that he was also Mark Seaver's very bestest friend in the whole wide world? Because he was. Oh yeah, they'd grown up together, they'd gone to school together. Wayne had attended the Seavers' wedding and Teresa's funeral. He even did the IT work for the Seavers' medical practice. They really were just the best of buds. And now, because of this random tip call, police were on their way to interview Mark's BFF about his own wife's murder. Sidebar, police are still incredibly thankful for the tip that led them to Wayne, because it really is like the only reason the case finally broke open. Now, when police did finally speak to Wayne for the first time, he not only denied having any involvement in Teresa's murder, but he also maintained that he wasn't even in Florida at the time of her death because he was homesick in bed, obviously. But despite this absolutely rock-solid alibi, police still thought that it might be beneficial to search his home and the surrounding property, which they did on July 12th, 2015. They also pulled and dissected his cell phone records, which is where they first learned of Wayne's close involvement with another career criminal, a man by the name of Jimmy Ray Rogers. But you can just call him the Hammer, because after all, it was his self-proclaimed nickname. Yeah. Wayne and Jimmy first met while serving time in 2011, and apparently they'd maintained a friendship following their release. And now there were rumors just swirling all around Missouri that both of them had actually been out of town the weekend of Teresa's murder. But when questioned regarding his friendship with Wayne and or his involvement in Teresa's death, Jimmy denied everything. He claimed he hadn't been to Florida, he hadn't been involved in the murder, and that he wasn't even friends with Wayne. And even though they knew he was lying at the very least about his friendship with Wayne, unfortunately, without any additional evidence against this man, police kind of hit a wall. But that didn't keep him down for long, because the additional evidence they needed eventually came through in the form of a GPS that they found in the center console of a vehicle that was parked in Wayne's driveway. At first, it didn't seem like that great of a find because all the previous destination information had been deleted. But, hi, technology, have you met her? Because very rarely is something that's been deleted actually gone for good. And sometimes, like in the case of this particular GPS, all it takes is the right skill set, determination, and about 100 hours of effort. And boom! Data recovered. And with this recovered data, police were able to very easily establish a recently traveled route from Curtis Wayne Wright's residence to Jimmy Ray Rogers' residence to Mark and Teresa Seavers' residence, and every stop in between, including a Walmart where Wayne and Jimbo Slice can be seen via CCTV purchasing a lockpicking set, garbage bags, cleaning items, basically just a whole kill kit. And as if all of that wasn't damning enough, when police questioned Jimmy's girlfriend, she got very emotional and told them everything. Now, to clarify, she was not directly involved in Teresa's death, but Jimmy had confessed the murder to her, and he actually took her with him when he disposed of some of the evidence from that night, which she later willingly led police to. So at this point, they know the who, they know the how, they know the when, and they know the where. The only gap they had yet to fill in was the why. Why had Wayne driven Jimmy 1,100 miles from Missouri to Florida, specifically to kill his best friend's wife? Suffice it to say, they were stumped. So they decided to strike up a deal with old CWW. If he can help them fill in the blanks, they'll let him plead out to secondary murder, effectively locking in just a 25-year sentence. And when staring down the barrel of life in prison otherwise, this proved to be a deal that Wayne simply could not refuse. So once the ink on his plea agreement dried, he told them everything. How he'd hired Jimmy to help him kill Teresa, how they'd driven all day and all night from Missouri to Florida to do so, and most importantly, he told them how Teresa's murder had been a paid hit orchestrated by none other than his very best friend and Teresa's very own husband, Mark Seavers. Dun dun dun. Just kidding. Go ahead and let me know down below how far back in the story you started to see that writing on the walls. Honestly, I don't remember chronologically where this falls in the story, but my aha moment was when I saw this. Maybe I'm just an asshole, but watching that for the first time, all I could think was, damn, homie is laying it on thick. Anyways, so according to Wayne, this plan had started to take shape just a few months earlier when Mark had been in Missouri for Wayne's wedding. Apparently, Mark had convinced Wayne that he and Teresa were having marital problems and that she was going to leave him and take their children, and that because Mark couldn't afford a messy divorce or an ugly custody battle, Naturally, the only solution was for Wayne to kill her. Am I the only person that thinks that this was just like a terrible wedding present? Imagine this. You register for a Vitamix, and instead you end up roped into this tomfoolery and get 25 years in prison. Yeah, it's a hard pass from me. Now, initially, Mark had actually wanted Wayne to kill Teresa right outside of her practice as she was leaving work one night. And get this, bonus points if he could take someone else out along with her. Because, if it looked more like a random killing, it might keep the suspicion off of them. I'm no expert, but what would probably keep, everybody out of hot water is if you don't hire someone to kill your wife. But that's just a thought. Again, not an expert, so don't take legal advice from me. Obviously, we know that this first draft of the plan is not the one that Wayne ended up going with, because I guess killing anyone and everyone at random was not something he was willing to do. So instead, things played out as follows. Wayne and Jimmy arrived in Bonita Springs early on the morning of June 28th. They made their way straight to the Seavers home, where they disabled the alarm system before heading to Walmart to get their supplies. And can I just interrupt for 1 second and tell you something that really pisses me off about this whole alarm thing? I hope you said yes, because I'm gonna. Okay, so Mark and Teresa had asked Mark's mom to come over while they were out of town so she could feed their dogs. And when she'd come by that day, it was actually right after these shitheads had blown through and messed with the alarm system. So when she was trying to leave, she couldn't get it to work. She couldn't rearm it. And when this woman found out what happened to Teresa, she blamed herself for her death.
Cried yesterday when I talked to the detective because I feel it was my fault.
No, not at all. No.
Well, how did they get in?
I know.
They break a window, the alarm would have gone off.
So imagine if they had never solved this case. That poor woman would have lived the rest of her life feeling like her daughter-in-law died because of something she did, when in actuality, it was because of something her son did. And no doubt he would have just let her live with it, because I can't imagine he was just gonna come clean to clear her conscience. Obviously, this information isn't crazy important to the overall weaving of the story, but it bothered me, so now it can bother you too. So once Wayne and Jimmy had their supplies and they knew that Mark's mom was gone and that they could easily get in, they returned to the Seavers house and just laid in wait for Teresa. And when she arrived home from the airport that evening, they proceeded to ambush her from behind with a hammer, ultimately striking her 17 times. When police compared the GPS records, surveillance video, phone records, and their discovery of $4.4 million worth of life insurance on Teresa, well, let's just say Wayne's story was not a difficult sell. And on February 26th, 2016, police set out to finally arrest the remaining player in this plot, Mr. Mark Seavers. Now, they were incredibly cautious in doing this because, as we discussed earlier, Mark had guns. Lots of guns. Just guns on guns on guns. Guns by the tons. And because police knew that he was so heavily armed, they felt that there may be cause for concern that he could possibly try to resist arrest by taking his own daughters hostage. But thankfully, he didn't, and he was taken into custody without incident almost exactly 8 months after his wife's murder. His trial began in October 2019 and lasted for almost 2 months. Wayne did hold up his end of the deal with the prosecution, giving a detailed testimony about how Mark had asked him to murder Teresa, how he promised to pay him $100,000 from her life insurance once it was done, how he'd paid to cover the cost of Wayne and Jimmy's trip to Florida and back, how they'd purchased burner phones and used code words in order to keep touch and finalize their plans long distance, and how ultimately, even though he and Jimmy had physically been the ones to kill Teresa, that Mark had been just as involved as they were. And in response to this testimony, Mark's defense tried to push forward the narrative that Wayne had acted on his own volition because he was desperately in love with Mark. Outrageous. And the prosecution and the judge thought so too, because every objection the prosecution made during this line of questioning was sustained immediately. And the judge eventually just shut it down altogether, forcing Mark's attorney to basically change up their whole strategy on the spot. So from there, they went on to try and discredit Wayne's story, claiming that as a successful doctor, Teresa was worth far more alive than she was dead, and that it simply didn't make sense for Mark to want her killed. But this was actually pretty easily disproven by dissecting the couple's personal text conversations and their finances. I'm not really going to get into all the details of that because honestly it would just be a real roundabout way to explain that they were broke and they argued a lot. So his motive was actually pretty crystal clear. Following closing arguments, the jury was dismissed for deliberations just before lunchtime on December 4th, 2019. And after just 4 hours, they returned with a verdict. 4.5 years after he'd orchestrated the death of his wife, Mark Sievers was found guilty of first-degree murder as well as conspiracy to commit murder. And in January of 2020, he was sentenced to death. He has tried to appeal his conviction and his sentence and tried to get a new trial and all of that.
Though a jury found me guilty, I am innocent of all charges, as I have maintained since this heinous crime took place. I am grateful, however, that the court can only determine my fate on earth, while my soul is in God's hands, and God knows the truth. Although I cannot feel remorse for something I had absolutely nothing to do with, I am deeply saddened and forever heartbroken, to say the very least, that Teresa was taken from us. I will miss her and cherish our memories until we are reunited in heaven. Until then, I will fight this wrongful conviction until I am proven innocent and set free to rejoin my family.
But so far, he's been unsuccessful, and he remains on death row at Rayford Prison in Bradford County, Florida, to this day. Wayne is currently serving his sentence of 25 years per his plea agreement, and Jimmy Ray Rogers is serving
life in prison
after being found guilty of second-degree murder at his own trial. Mark and Teresa's daughters were placed in the custody of Teresa's mother in 2016, and as far as I was able to find, they have not maintained a relationship with their father. Which about wraps us up for today. As always, I thank you so much for spending some time here with me today and for listening to Teresa's story. It's really unfortunate that not only was Teresa robbed of her life, but her girls were robbed of their mother and their father. And honestly, the world was probably robbed of some pretty great things that Teresa would have likely gone on to do. But now we'll never know. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. Do you think Mark was responsible for Teresa's death? Or do you believe that Wayne really did act out because of his deep, secret, just white-hot desire for Mark? Can't wait to hear your thoughts. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and turn on your post notifications and all that YouTube crap. I put out new videos as often as I can right now, and I'd certainly love to catch you back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.